Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress and welcome to today's webinar, Give Powerful Ad Hoc Query Powers to Your ASP.NET Grid Users, presented by DevExpress Web Program Manager Mehul and DevExpress Technical Evangelist Don Wibier. In this webinar, learn how to use the new DevExpress ASP.NET Query Builder control. You'll learn how to get started with the control, its limits, and how it will help make your end users into pro users by giving them the power to query. This session is being recorded and it will be available on our DevExpress YouTube channel later today. We will also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Mehul and Don.
Thanks very much, Amanda. Welcome, everybody. And as Amanda mentioned, this is about giving powerful ad hoc querying powers to your end users through ASP.NET. And the way you're going to do that is by using our new ASP.NET control, the DevExpress ASP.NET QueryBuilder control. So really, this webinar we want to highlight is about getting started with that control. So I'm joined by my excellent colleague, Don. Don, how are you doing today?
I'm fine, Mehul.
All right, so Don and I, we were talking, and this is a new control that we just introduced in the last release. And in the What's New webinar, we covered kind of it initially, just a little bit about what the control is and maybe how it looks, but we weren't really showing you how to get started with it, and we wanted to dive into a little bit of that. And so today, that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to show you how to get started with the control, and then dig a little deeper into how could you customize it with restrictions, what are its limitations, and then specifically, Don's going to show us some code, including not just how to get started with it, but what another example of using the query builder with a card view sample. And finally, we'll wrap up with a little Q&A. So let's just dive right into it. The query builder control, simply straightforward, is a new control that we've introduced with our 15.2 release. And it's a separate control, but originally it came from our reporting suite. So in our reporting suite, we gave the ability to let the end users customize the report by letting them choose what the query looks like. So in essence, now you can use a query builder to customize just about any type of control. So let's see what this looks like in action. Now, there's the initial blog post for it. If we just run this, and Don's going to show us how to get started with this simple example here. But let's say I've got a grid, and I can page through the grid. The only problem with this approach is that if the end user is a high-level power user and they want to decide what data goes in here, well, they're going to constantly need to come back to you, because the way the data grid exists right now, it exists on the server as a control with a SQL data source, and it is bound to a custom select command that is hard-coded. Now, that doesn't leave a lot of options for the end user who says, hey, I want to dynamically change what kind of data and where that data comes from. Well, this query builder is exactly perfect for that power user that says, give me the power to decide what goes in here, so I don't have to keep coming back to the ASP.NET developer or the DBA and say, hey, change this information out. So it can be really useful. So now when I hit that query builder, you can see I've got a full screen layout here, and this is the query builder. On the right hand side, I have a list of available tables, and these are based on the connection that I defined to it, and I've got some menu items here for deleting and saving the query. Now, one thing I want to point out real quick is that this is one of the newer controls, and because it is, we are always constantly thinking about things like responsiveness. So as you can see here, as I resize this control, it will support some semblance of responsiveness. Now, responsiveness, people tend to think right away it has to do with phones. It's not about phones. Really, it's about different browser sizes. So this control is responsive, but this is a larger control. As you can see, it takes up the full screen, because if I come in here and let's say I want a different query besides the one where I'm just getting something like products, I could come in here and say, give me products and the customers who perhaps bought those products. I'm sorry, actually, you know what, instead of products, let's do customers. I'm sorry, orders. So the orders and the customers who bought those orders. Now in the database there is already a join. So this designer is going to honor that and show me, hey, you already have a customer link here between customer ID and ID of the customer's table. So that's a really nice feature because now I don't have to make that explicit connection. And I can see that, hey, if I come in here and pick out, let's say, the customer ID, and let's say we'll grab the, let's just grab the PO number from here. And from the customer side, actually, we'll grab a couple of things like sales amount and maybe ship date. And from the customer side, I would just want to get their name. So let's grab ID and name. And now we save sale amount and ship date as well. And now when I hit the save button, it's going to apply it. Now I can go further and customize, aggregation, group by, and so forth. But if I just want to quickly change out, what'll happen is as soon as I save the query, typically, as you saw, we'd have to change it on the SQL data source, but now, dynamically, as the end user, I have redefined what data appears in here. So now, I have the customer ID, I have the customer name, the PO number, the sales amount, and the ship date. And if I've done any other features on the grid, like sorting and grouping, I can enable that, or paging, but dynamically, we have changed and given the power to the end users. So, it's a very powerful feature that can allow the the end users to manage how they change out the data. Now, Don, how is this magic done? What sorcery, wizardry are we using to enable this feature, and how can our developers, customer developers, start using this feature?
Well, that's actually pretty simple, and well, as we pointed out in the agenda, the Getting Started screen, the Getting Started is already been done by you. Let me switch over to Visual Studio and show you how we set up the demo that you have just been showing. So, right here, I have prepared a little project, and I have put in a couple of things which are pretty standard, like I've put on an SQL data source which points to the database. I have put a button on there which will redirect us to the QueryBuilder page, and I have set up a grid view which is bound to the SQL data source. The only thing that I did code in is that I am going to create the columns at runtime of the grid. And well, the reason is obviously because it's a very flexible control, the QueryBuilder, and we can get whatever columns back in the result sets that whatever we selected. So that's a bit of code which I will not dive into right now, but I'll explain it a bit later. And yeah, basically when we run the application, you'll see that we will have this grid just like you saw in the demo, and once I hit the QueryBuilder, I'm going to the query.aspx, but in this case this page is completely empty because now I'm going to show you how easy it is to set up this QueryBuilder functionality. So to do that, I have already added a query.aspx page. And as you can see, it's completely empty. I just added it, and also in the code behind I haven't put anything in there yet. So let us start by setting up this QueryBuilder control, and that is as easy as looking it up in the toolbox, and here it is. I'm going to drag it in, and what you'll see is the design time appearance of this QueryBuilder control. Obviously, we will not connect to the data store that we want to use by design time. So we'll have like this nice picture which has a couple of instructions which are worth mentioning. The first one is to display the QueryBuilder call its open connection method. I'll get to that after the second note, which is a bit smaller mentioned, but I do like to point it out. And that is that we need to have all the necessary JavaScript libraries referenced, or we have to set a web.config setting. The query builder is using a number of client-side JavaScript libraries like jQuery, jQuery UI, and let me switch over to the slide deck, Knockout.js and Globalize. And well, if you want to use this query builder control in an existing application, then the chances might be that you already reference jQuery or jQuery UI or all of them. So if you don't change a web.config setting, you might run into some jQuery or other JavaScript conflicts. So it's not really like a difficult thing, but you should be aware of the fact that if you are already referencing those libraries, you might want to go to the web.config, and in the DevExpress settings there is an embed required client library setting, which is defaulted to true. In case you already reference libraries, you might want to set it to false and reference the other libraries manually in your application. So it is a node, yeah.
So let's just add, we mentioned this is one of the newer controls that supports a lot of that responsive behavior, and the control, it feels very much like a client-side control, and that's because it has a lot of client-side features. So that's a good point to bring up, Don, is that because we are making use of those libraries like jQuery and so forth, that if you are using them and you don't want to have some kind of version conflict or something like that, you can simply disable that web config setting Don mentioned, and it'll simply use the one that you're already got referenced in your project.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right, so let's get back to the first statement, because to display the query builder, we should call its open connection method. Well, let's just do that by coding that into the page load event. And this open connection method has a number of overloads, and as you can see, and you can look it up in the documentation as well, it's got like one which will receive a connection string name from the web.config. So in this case I'm using that one. It's got some other ones, and I'll deal with one of the other overloads a bit later. But for now, this is basically the only thing you need to do to set up the query builder. So if we now run the application, let me head back to the default page, and I'll hit the button query builder. You'll notice that we now have this page that you already saw in the demo, and we've got all of our entities from the database in these available tables. If your database has like views or stored procedures, they can be used as well, and they will be displayed as well. But this database is our DevAV demo database, and it only has a couple of tables, so stored procedures and views are not in this particular application. And by just calling that open connection method, I'll be able to use all this really nice stuff. But now, once we have defined our query, we want to have that posted back to the grid view. And for that, I mean, if I do something right now, the only thing I can do is I can hit this data preview, which will just give you a quick demo of the result set. But now I need to hand it over, and for that, the way to go is to hit that save button. But before that save button does anything, we need to code in an onSave event on this query builder control. So if I go to the properties here and switch over to the events, you'll see that there is like this save query event, and this is also the only place where you can have access to the SQL statement that is being produced by the query builder. Because the query builder doesn't have like an SQL parser, so it's able to read like some SQL statements, and you can also not extract the generated SQL statement like at any given time. So the only way to access that generated SQL statement is in this exact event. And if we check the event arguments, you'll see that there is a property which is called select statement, which is the one we're interested in right now. And there is another one which I'll point out a couple of minutes later. So what we can do to make this all happen is I can use a session variable. For instance, the session variable, let me get another bracket, and just store the select statement in there. And once we have done that, we need to go back to the default page. I do like to point out that we cannot use a response redirect for that, because this is being executed in a callback. So this is being executed through JavaScript. And if you want to do a redirect after this callback has been finished, we have put in a very nice static method on the ASPX edit class, which allows you to just do that, which is the method redirect on callback. And this will make sure that some stuff is being added and some JavaScript is being added during the callback, so we'll still be able to be redirected to another page. With this in place, we are at least able to switch back to the results page. So let me put in a quick query. I'm going to select a couple of things here, and once I hit the save button, you'll see that we are being redirected to the default page. Default page is just displaying the initial SQL statement, so we need to code in something on the default page as well. And that is just a matter of checking if that session variable is there, and if that session variable is there, we're going to change the select command of the SQL data source, and we're going to post in that SQL that was being generated on the other page. And with that in place, I have already also coded in this ASPX grid view data binding event, which will add the columns dynamically. And the code which is here below, I'll point that out on the last portion of the demo. So with this in place, we'll have the query builder handing over the results back to the grid view. So if I now click this, and I'll get the order items, and I'll get the orders. Well, you'll see that the relationship has already been made because there are some constraints and some foreign keys defined in the database. And I could now select a number of things here, and I could select a number of things here. And once I hit the button, you'll see that the grid has been changed. So it would also be nice if we go back to the query builder that we can just fine-tune our query. So if I hit this button, you'll notice that the design surface is empty again. And this brings us to this on saving event, to that second property which I stepped over in the first place. Because as I mentioned, the query builder is unable to parse SQL. So if we want to save the state of the designer, we need to code in something else. We need to store something else. And let me get back to that save query event. I'm going to assign another session variable. I'm just going to call it T, which is obviously not one of the best practices, but for this demo it's perfect. And then there is this other property which is called the result query. And this is actually where the QueryBuilder works with. So it doesn't work directly with SQL, but it will work with this property, which holds a number of things, which allows us to restore the design service, basically. What we then need to do is we need to change this open connection method, and we need to use one of the overloads in case that session variable has been set. So let me remove this line and change it slightly to this. So what we do here is I'll check if the session variable exists, and if that is the case, I will use one of the overloads which receives a table query type as second parameter. And this allows us to restore the design service with the tables already on that, which are used in the SQL statement. And once that's been done, we'll have the demo pretty much as you already saw at the beginning of this webinar. So let me design another query here. Well, I'm going to go for the product ID, product price, and the invoice number. So this is easy to remember. Once I hit the Save button, you'll see that we have the product ID, the product price, and the invoice number. And once I switch back to the QueryBuilder, you will see that the selection has been restored because of that second session variable that I have introduced in this demo. So another thing that I'd like to show you is because, let me switch back to the agenda here. You might want to use this control on a database which has a large amount of entities. So it might be a database with like 100+ tables or something. And well, maybe you don't want to give your end user access to all of those tables. So it would be nice if you could restrict the amount of tables that are shown in the QueryBuilder, so that we could actually, more or less restrict this list and only show like a couple of tables or views or stored procedures, or just to hide out some information. And that is also possible. And I'm going to show you how you can do that. It will require you to use a bit of coding, but this demo is available on GitHub afterwards, so you can just download it and see what it does and play a bit around with it. The steps for restricting those entities require you to create a schema provider. After you have defined that schema provider, which will be used by this QueryBuilder, you'll need a factory class to instantiate one of those schema providers. And the last step is you will need to register that factory class to the application, which normally happens in the global ASICS file. So let me begin with the first step. I have already set up a small C# file which is empty. And I'm going to start with the schema provider. The schema provider needs to implement a certain interface, which is the IDB schema provider interface. And once you implement the interface, you'll see that you need to code in two methods. The first one requires a bit more code as the second one, so I'll start with the first one. And that is basically that we are going to return a new schema which excludes the stuff that we don't want to see, basically. And the most easy way to do that is by requesting the current schema, so the schema of the connection being passed in. And once we have that, we can extract a number of properties. For instance, we can get an array with all the views in this current schema. And we can also get an array with stored procedures, which is also being retrieved from this schema. And in this example, we don't have any, so I don't do anything with it. So these will be empty arrays. But the last one is the table array. And what I'll do here is I will just perform a simple link query on the default schema.tables array, where I will filter out all entities which start with order. So that means that if we're going to run this demo in a minute, that these two tables will be disappeared. And the last thing what we need to do is we're going to return a new DB schema instance with the properties that we have been retrieving from the original schema or the modified versions of it. And with this in place, we can continue to the second method that we need to implement. And that second method is a fairly simple one. It will just call the connection.loadDB columns, where we pass in everything which was passed in as a parameter on this method as well. So with this step 1, the schema provider, we can now continue by setting up the factory class. And the factory class is also a class which implements a certain interface, which is a bit longer interface name. And well, this only has one method that we need to implement, and that is basically we need to return a newly created instance of that schema provider that we just coded on top. So like this. So the factory class was also fairly straightforward. And now the last thing that we need to do is we need to register this schema provider factory to the application. And the way that we can do that is in the global ASICS file in the application start by just adding this generic static method which registers the provider factory to the system. And with this in place, if I now run the application, you'll see, if I switch to the query builder, that the two tables starting with order has disappeared. So this whole procedure is pretty well documented in our support center as well, but I mean, I thought it'll be a good idea to give you an impression on how this works. And as you can see, you can filter on any criteria, or you can hard code the tables or whatever. So very nice feature.
It is very nice, and thank you, Don, because I think that leads us to our next point in the table of contents, was to talk about limitations. So before we get to that last sample, let's talk a little bit about the card view, the query builder. And as Don just demonstrated, that you can do some things like customizing it so that way you don't expose all your tables. And you can saw, as you saw, that you have to define that, because we can't dynamically know what tables you do and don't want to. But you may say, well, hey, that's not so simple, and a SQL data source is much simple, and that's exactly correct. This control is not for everybody. We're not saying go and replace your SQL data source and start using the query builder for everything, because it comes with, as they say, great power. It's also got great responsibility for you as a developer to ensure that you perhaps lock down and make sure that you don't expose all your tables. And another limitation you may want to consider is that when you're using the query builder, when you're using the SQL data source, let's say with our ASP grid view, you're going to be able to let the grid view create the columns for you. In this case, you saw that Don was dynamically adding the columns. And another thing is that the column types may not be generated, because in ASPX grid view, the SQL data source has access to that rich schema Versus in the query builder, you saw that we were actually just getting a SQL query string and then applying that string to the specific control that we're binding to, in this case, the ASPX grid view. But when you're using SQL data source, let's say if you have a column of date type, the grid view is automatically going to create a date type column. Now, that isn't to say the query builder is really lacking. The query builder is just designed for a different scenario for a power user that wants to dynamically change what data they're looking at without you, the developer, having to create several different views. And it says, okay, on this page, I'm going to have a grid that goes to the customers table. On this page, it's going to go to the orders table. And so instead, you can just say, hey, I've got one page for Samantha or Bob or whoever that says constantly, hey, I want to change, give me the power to do it. And for those scenarios, Query Builder is perfect. For, I believe, most general scenarios, the ASPX grid view with the SQL data source will be great for you. But again, in those cases, just consider that these limitations are there. We give you the power to customize it. Now, Don, what is this last card view sample about?
Well, you might be aware of the fact that this card view control has been released officially in our 15.2 release. And I thought it'll be a nice idea to show you how you can use this query builder control with other data aware controls as well, instead of just the grid. So I'm going to show you how to set it up, and I'm also going to show you how you can dynamically add those columns. So we can do some fun stuff with that. So let me switch back to my demo application, and I have already set up a page which is the cards.aspx. This page only contains two things, which is the SQL data source as well as a button which will redirect us to the query builder. And if I switch over to design, you'll see that this is how it looks. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to drag in the card view control. And I'm going to choose a data source for the card view control. I'm going to assign the SQL data source to it. And well, with this in place, we're pretty much set up to run the application. I'm going to disable the allow, edit, insert, and delete because you need to configure some additional properties on the SQL data source if you want to support that as well. But I could introduce the search panel, or I might want to introduce the header panel as well, just because I can. And well, when I run the application right now, we'll see that we have a similar application or a results page, but now in a card view mode. So here we have all our employees, and once I hit the query builder, I'll be redirected to the same query builder page, except that I have specified a query string parameter. So I'm going to make a small change on the query builder page that I will check if this query string parameter is there. I'm going to be redirecting back to the cards view demo. So I can use the same page for both of the demos. So let me start with that, and I'm gonna do a little check exactly here, and I'm gonna say I'm gonna do it just inline. And we were checking for S, and if that equals card, I'm going to return the cards.aspx. Otherwise, we'll be going to the default.aspx. So now I already have this query builder page working for both demos, and I'm gonna need to do a couple of things on the cards code as well. So let me switch over to the card view and code in one of the events. And that is going to be the data binding event, because we need to recreate the columns once the card view has been data bound. And I'm not going to code something in there right now. I will first make sure that the query is being assigned, or the SQL statement is being assigned to the SQL data source, just like I did on the other page as well. Well, I've got the response redirect. I'm gonna leave this one empty, and this is because I'd like to show you what Mehul was mentioning about columns being auto-generated and stuff like that. I will check one thing. Let me switch back to the page, and I'm gonna say a couple of things. I'm gonna make sure that the auto-generating fields is set to true. And now I'll show you why I'm going to generate those columns by code instead of by using this property, because this property is really easy and really nice. But let me switch over to the query builder, and let me select, for instance, the employees table together with the pictures table. Because the employee has a picture ID which is linked to this pictures table, and this data field holds binary data representing the image of this particular employee. So if I now select a number of fields here, including this one, and I'll switch back to the card view, you will see that that image has not been shown. And this is what Mehul was mentioning earlier. This is one of the reasons that I'm going to create those columns by code, because then I can check and determine which column it should be. So we can do that pretty straightforward. I'm going to remove this one, and I'm going to switch back to the code behind, because what I'm going to add here, I am going to call a method which is called addColumns. And this addColumns method is something that I need to code in. The way that that's going to work is, let me first code in that method. And what we basically do here, I'm going to check if we're getting a card view, and next I'm going to clear all the existing columns, and now I'm going to use a method to determine which columns are in the result set of the SQL data source. I'm retrieving this data view, and this data view has a property table.columns, which is a collection with all the data columns of this result set. And this is exactly what we want, because now I can call another method, which I will code in just after this one, where I will determine which column type we should add to the card view. What I'm also going to do, because the card view as well as the grid view, they work best when we have a key field name property set. So if we know the field name, the ID field of the result set. So what I'm doing is I'm going to make the first available field in the result set, I'm going to make that the key field, so the primary key basically. And this is if you want to enable searching, grouping, sorting, all that kind of stuff, then you would have to set that key field name property. Optionally, you could decide to not show that first field, but I've commented that out because I'd like to see it. So now we need to create this addColumn method, and well, there are a couple of ways to do that. I personally don't like a huge if-else-if code block which determines like if the data type is an integer, then I'm going to create a column like that, or if it is a date time, then I'm going to do that. I'd like to do that a bit more efficient, And for that, I'm going to include a small dictionary. And this is just something I'd like to show you. It is a dictionary which I've made static, read-only. So there will be only one instance of this dictionary, and it has a key of the type, and the value type is also a type. And I'm going to call it a column map. And because I made it static and read-only, I'm going to initialize it on the fly here. And what I'm doing here is that this is basically the data type of one of those columns, and this is the data type of the column in the card view which should be created. And with this in place, I can have a very small add column method, because I can now just check the dictionary and see if that column or that the type is inside the dictionary, just like this. So I'm going to check if that field type is available. Then I'm going to get that column type. If not, I'm just going to return a text column. So it's just a small piece of pretty efficient code. And well, I didn't code in all the columns, but you can easily add it yourself in the demo. And then I need to create an instance of that particular column type, which can be done by the following construct. So I'm just going to use the activator to create an instance of this column type that was returned by the dictionary. And with that in place, the only thing I need to do is set the field name, which I did pass in on this method, and I am going to add that column to the card view. And with that in place, we'll see that if one of the result columns is a byte array that we just had on this demo, I'm going to return a binary image column. So let's see how that works. By running the demo, and we'll be on the default SQL statement again. So let me get back to the query builder and get the employees and get the pictures table. I'm going to select the ID, the key field. I'm going to do the first and the last name, and finally I'm going to do the data. So this is pretty much what I did before. And now when I hit the save button, see that we have been adding a binary image column to this card view, and it's now just showing those images of those guys and girls out of the database without too much additional code. So Mehul, I'd say that was a very nice demo.
Yeah, that is very cool. Again, I really like pictures, so I think that was one of the key things about the card view control. So thank you very much, and I liked how the custom column binding is also very nice and useful. All right, so let's just recap. Getting started is really easy. You drop the control. It's got a drag and drop story, but after that you do need to write some code to say here's your data connection. Once you have the data connection, here's the SQL string, and then you can save it as Don showed in a section variable, and then apply that SQL string to whichever control, whether it's a card view or the grid view. Now if you want to go further, you can customize what data which user has access to, and Don showed that you can write some query some code that defines which schema items to display and to restrict. And finally, let's just talk about the limitations once again. I want to be clear, this is a very awesome, powerful feature, but it's not for everybody. But if you have those power users that are asking for this feature, go ahead and give it to them. See what they think. They're probably going to think you're a superhero. So that's the scenario we wanted to help you enable to give your end users that feeling that says, hey, these developers are great. They really allow me the power and the functionality to get my job done. So for those users, it could be great. For maybe average users who don't care for this feature, maybe they don't need it. So once again, just consider some of the limitations with this approach. But again, if you want that power, it is very powerful. You can apply it to not just the grid view, but the card view and other controls that support the functionality of dynamically changing out the queries. All right, now with that, Amanda, I'll give it back to you. Is there any questions or answers that we could help people with?
Yeah, we've had questions come in. I don't know if either of you can see the questions panel. Let's see.
Hey, Amanda, I can barely hear you for some reason.
Oh, what about now?
A little better.
A little better?
It's still pretty soft.
Still pretty soft.
Oh, so we've got some questions, you said? Okay, so can you...
Some questions.
Okay, let me just see. Well, we got some. We answered a couple, I think. It says, can you load pre-built queries in the builder? Pete, great question. So Don and I were actually discussing the exact thing. Hey, Don, can you bring up the UI real quick, the end result of the grid? And
yeah, sure.
So whether it's this approach or even if it's just a grid, you can build, let's say, another user interface. Now, we were thinking about, now this is fun right here, Don. Let's say on the right-hand side, you can add a list box. And in the list box, you can populate it with several pre-built queries. And the queries don't actually have to look like SQL. You could call it get, customers with orders before July or something like that, and behind it would be the actual query that applies to it. And when the end user clicks on that, that could be dynamically applied using either the query builder. Really, you don't even need the query builder because you're just applying queries. So what you're really asking is, can you build an interface? So you can absolutely build an interface. We were thinking about doing it, but just we didn't want to run this, demo into a 2-hour-long demo, but it should be fairly straightforward, and yes, you can absolutely do that. All right.
Yeah, I think I'd like to point out that if you want to save this definition, it might be clear in this demo that you will need to use this table query object for it. So suppose you have created one, you need to store this to some database or file or whatever, because this is the stuff that you can put in the query builder, so it will load up its initial schema basically.
Exactly. And another customer named Paul also asked a similar question that says, can queries be persisted and made available in a drop-down list? And as Don just mentioned, yes, take the result query there, save it into, you can either save them into a database and then load them up per user to show them, hey, here's your recent queries that you ran. Or you could just have a drop-down list or any control, really, where you want to show the queries. So the answer is absolutely yes, you can do that. Now, Geert, I'm sorry, Geert, Geert is an awesome customer. I'm sorry for butchering your name. He was asking about customizing column names. Is the load columns method where this should be done? So Geert was asking Don that, because we're dynamically loading these column names, are the column names customizable? Now, with the grid view, there is methods, let's say pre-render or something like that, where you can do that. But is it possible through the query builder methods to perhaps do that, like intercept some of the column names?
Yes, there is. We probably didn't point that out precisely, but if I switch back to the query builder here, we can, for instance, go here and I can set up an alias. So I could change this over to image, for instance. So now my data field will not be displayed as data, but it will be displayed as, well, my portrait.
Ah, right. So you can do it right to the UI. That's great.
Yeah, you can just enter it here, and if I now switch over, you'll see that that will be the case. And you might wonder why there is a space between the my and the portrait. Well, that is just a little bit of DevExpress magic, because we check actually those column field names, and if we encounter something like a first name or a last name or something with a capital and another capital, then we'll put a space in between for the column title basically.
Yep, and you can turn that off if you don't like it, but I think it's a useful feature because who wants to look at first name without a space. Okay, now there was also another question here, and I think Geert also had a similar question about can you intercept so that certain rows are not displayed to the end user? Again, Geert, absolutely. I think for that approach, you definitely want to look at it through the control, like the grid, for example, you're using. In certain scenarios, though, you may just ask yourself, like, maybe instead of having a particular database that you're showing off, you might just want to have a separate set of tables that the customer should have access to, and that way you're doing less filtering and so forth. Now, Don, what did you want to show us here?
Well, I'm already showing because we did obviously a couple of real simple queries, but if you want to have like a where statement, for instance, I'm defining that right now. So I'm now creating a statement which will also have a where statement, so that allows you to filter out all kinds of stuff.
That's a very nice feature of the UI. What Geet's specifically asking is that he does not want the end user to have access to some of those items. Now, the end user is not going to define their own limitations, right? It's up to the developers to do that. But that's a good feature to show off. Thank you, Don. All right, now Brian asked that question, and Brian, you just saw Brian was asking, where can you define where clauses? Well, Don just showed you. When you click on that filter editor, you've got this very nice UI that can do that as well. Now, there was a question that says, what aggregate functions are supported? Will the control automatically group by the rest of the columns? So what grouping options do we have and aggregate functions do we have, Don?
Well, we've got the most things like, well, let me just show you. That might be the easiest way. So let me get rid of this one and that one. If I now go to, I just filtered out the order items, which is, okay, so I can't show it that fast probably. Let me see, products, product images maybe. And I could say, I could count the number of product images which are there. And I can do that by, I first have to define this one. So I could go here or there. And then I could say I want to have an aggregate on the count of the products. And let me see where that went. I did it the other day. Okay, so I can't find it, I can't show it to you that quickly, but you can do the aggregate things like group by, you can count, you can do a sum, all that kind of stuff is in there.
Yeah, I know it's, yes, on certain tables where you've got the proper joins, it is absolutely possible to do that.
I think I didn't put up the proper joins on this.
That's fine. Well, let me address another question, maybe while you're looking around for that, and that is, Brian asked, what happens if users select tables that do not join together or don't have a foreign key relationship defined? Well, in that case, then the grid view won't be able to properly display the tables there, right? So, for example, if you're trying to say, get me all of the customers and all of the orders from the customers, well, if the relationship isn't there, then the grid view can't go and figure out, okay, this ID belongs with that ID and therefore are actually the same data. So really just as the same thing that would happen in any grid, and that is that you're not going to get a proper display of the data. All right, so I don't think we have, oh, there was one question about MVC. Will this query control be available in MVC? in general, I've said it before, we always try to bring as much as we can to our MVC product line, and this is no different. We will try unless there is something really preventing us. Now, one thing that I should also mention is that this query builder was just released in this version. It's not fully baked yet, but as we work on that, and generally when we work to finish all the features for this control, we release in a preview mode, and when it comes in the release mode, we usually bring an MVC version. So during our final testing, final bits, and final features, we add those little finishing touches. So with that, I'll say thank you very much for joining. You are excellent, and we appreciate your feedback. And if you have any feedback for us, email us at don@DevExpress or mharry@DevExpress. We're also on Twitter. Amanda, we'll hand it back to you. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks guys. All right, everybody, check out devexpress.com/webinars for all upcoming webinars and to access previously recorded webinar sessions. Our next webinar is next Tuesday, March 15th, Compiling a DevExtreme App. Move away from Alert as a debugging option. You've reached the point where you want to compile your app written with DevExtreme to target iOS or Android natively. You fire up PhoneGap or Cordova, compile, run the results on the device, and from out of nowhere, a bug surfaces that's not visible when executed as a web app. Or even worse, you're using some third-party plugins in the compiled app and the bug only shows up then. How do you debug the app on the device? Join Paul and Julian as they discuss this common scenario and come up with some techniques and solutions to help you. And then March 22nd is Functional JavaScript. Too many developers use JavaScript as some kind of peculiar object-oriented programming language. In reality, it goes way further than that by supporting higher-order functions. Join Julian and Paul as they discuss writing JavaScript in a functional style. So those are the two webinars coming up in the next couple of weeks. And again, today's webinar will be available later on our DevExpress YouTube channel. I posted the link in the chat box earlier. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Mehul and Don. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.